I was 23 when I moved into a small, cheap apartment just outside of Cleveland. It wasn't much: beige walls, outdated fixtures, and a kitchen that barely fit a table. The rent was low though, and I was trying to save after college, so I didn't really mind. The building was quiet, the kind where you could hear your neighbors sneeze through the walls but barely ever saw them, except for apartment 3F. It was the last unit at the end of my hall, and it always looked dark. No nameplate on the door, no lights on inside, and the door looked wrong, like it had been forced shut too hard, with the hinges slightly warped. At first, I figured it was vacant. People came and went in this building all the time, but it wasn't long before I realized it wasn't just empty. Something was completely off about that apartment. It started with the noises. I'm not talking about loud music or arguments, the usual apartment stuff. These were small sounds. Knocking, not on my door, but on the wall separating my apartment from 3F. It was so quiet that I might have ignored it completely if it hadn't been so consistent. Every night, 3 soft knocks. At first, I tried to explain it away. Old pipes, the building settling, but it kept happening. Same pattern, same time. Then there was the light. I came home late one night after working overtime and saw it. A thin sliver of yellow light leaking from under the door of 3F. It struck me because the place was supposed to be empty. The door hadn't been opened in weeks, and I'd never seen anyone go in or out. The next day, I brought it up casually with the building manager. "Hey, who lives in 3F? I thought it was vacant." He blinked, flipping through his clipboard. "It is. Power shut off. Place has been empty since the last guy left." I looked at him, hoping he would elaborate on why the last tenant left. He paused, then shrugged. "Personal reasons." I didn't ask what those reasons were, but after knowing what I know now, I probably should have. A week later, an actual knock occurred at my door around 2 a.m. I was half asleep, disoriented. At first, I even thought it was part of my dream, but then there were more knocks, louder this time. I forced myself up and opened the door, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, the whole building was silent, but when I glanced down towards 3F, the door was cracked, just slightly. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, convinced I was imagining things. I had to be. The next morning, though, I noticed something much worse. The peephole on my door was missing. Just gone, like someone had unscrewed it carefully, from the outside. By then, I knew something was wrong. That night, I made up my mind to stay awake and watch the door to 3F. I pressed my eye to the peephole every few minutes, hoping to see anything. The hallway was dark, and the door to 3F was closed. And then, as I was watching, I heard it. The same knocking. 3 slow taps coming from the wall that separated my room with 3F. I stared through the peephole, heart pounding, and then, I swear, a shadow shifted just out of view. I couldn't blame it on being asleep. I was awake and knew what I saw. Something or someone was in there. I went back and laid in my bed, but I did not sleep at all that night. The next morning, I reported it to the building manager. This time he didn't brush it off. He showed up with a maintenance worker and his master key, ready to check inside. I stood back as they opened the door to 3F. It was much worse than I expected. The entire apartment was bare. No furniture, no boxes, nothing. Just thick dust on the floors and a sour, stale smell. The manager was muttering about the power being off when he stopped suddenly. "What the hell is that?" He stepped forward and shined his flashlight into the far corner, behind the kitchen counter. There was a pile of blankets. Not trash, not abandoned old bedding, a sleeping bag. half-zipped with a half-eaten sandwich resting on a paper plate nearby. And right next to the blanket, as if it were left there deliberately, a serrated hunting knife. We left the apartment immediately, and the building manager called the police. It took almost 40 minutes for them to arrive, but when they did, the scene changed entirely. 2 officers entered the unit, checking every corner, but whoever had been staying there was long gone. One of the officers, the younger one, knelt by the pile of blankets and shook his head. "This wasn't just some homeless guy," he said quietly, gesturing at the knife. "The food's fresh. Look how it's placed. It's like he was waiting for someone." Then they found the utility bill, folded neatly and tucked inside the sleeping bag. At first, I thought it was just my mail that had slipped inside the wrong unit, but when they unfolded it, I realized the bill wasn't mine. It was from 6 months ago. The name on it matched the previous tenant of 3F, the same one the manager said had left mid-lease. When I asked why the tenant left, the officer said, "Drug charges. He owed a lot of money to the wrong people. No one's seen him since his arrest." I moved out the next week. I theorized the person in 3F was not a squatter. They were waiting for the old tenant to come back to get their money, or worse. They had been waiting. I think the reason they took my peephole off was to make sure I was asleep and not a witness to whatever they had planned. I know that my life was not in danger, but the thought that someone was willing to murder another person in a room next to mine was too much for me to handle. A few years back, I rented an apartment from a friend of mine. He had recently purchased the place and fully renovated it before putting it up for sale. When he couldn't find a buyer, I offered to rent it in the meantime. After moving in, it didn't take long to realize something was completely off about my next-door neighbor. I would guess she was around 45, but worn down by time in a way I couldn't quite place. At night, she would stay up for hours, listening to Christian radio shows at full volume while talking loudly, sometimes yelling, to someone who clearly wasn't there. It got so bad that I couldn't sleep, so one night, I finally decided to confront her. I knocked on her door, and when she opened it just enough to look at me, I caught a glimpse inside. Her walls were completely covered with crosses, painted in different colors. Words like Jesus and angels were scribbled all over them. The windows were painted black, blocking out every trace of sunlight. The place reeked of dampness. The carpets were stained yellow, looked decades old, and the floor was littered with cockroaches and piles of dog mess, but there was no dog in sight. Trying to keep calm, I politely asked her to keep the noise down. She just stared at me for a moment, expressionless, before shutting the door in my face. Moments later, the radio blared even louder. I got really angry, but I didn't really feel like dealing with the police, so I just tried to ignore it. The next night, my girlfriend stayed over. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sensation of someone watching me. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a shadow standing next to the bed, just staring at us. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. Sometimes in the dark, when you're half asleep, your mind plays tricks on you. But then, the shadow spoke. It was my neighbor. She had somehow broken into my apartment and was standing there, watching us sleep, clutching something in her hand. "You should lock your door at night," she whispered. And then, just like that, she turned and left. I was paralyzed by fear and could only move my eyes, and then everything went black. The next morning, I woke up disturbed, still questioning if it had really happened, until I heard noises from outside my bedroom window. I looked down and saw her, standing just below, talking to herself in some strange, garbled language. She was speaking in tongues. In her hand, she held a plastic bag, a bag that was dripping with something red. It was hot as hell outside, and I could smell death from it, and then I realized She was carrying her rotting dead dog in that bag. That's when I knew I wasn't just dealing with a strange neighbor. She was dangerous, mentally ill, or both. Terrified, I went upstairs to speak with another neighbor, hoping someone could explain what the hell was going on. The man I spoke to looked just as scared as me. Apparently she had broken into his apartment too, while he was watching TV with his kids. He got up to grab a snack from the kitchen, and when he turned back around, she was standing behind his couch, staring at him, holding a power drill. Was that what she was holding when she broke into my apartment? At this point, I was scared out of my mind. I called the police. They already knew who she was. Apparently, she was a violent schizophrenic who had stopped taking her medication. But since she owned her apartment, they couldn't really enter without her consent. They could only intervene if she left the building. So I waited. For 2 days, I stayed awake, listening for any sign that she would leave. Finally, at 2 a.m., I heard the door unlock. She was heading across the street to the 7-Eleven. I called the police immediately. Within 2 minutes, 3 squad cars and a special intervention van showed up. They restrained her on the sidewalk and loaded her into the van, driving off in complete silence. And just like that, it was as if she had never been there. I never saw her again, and I do feel bad because she is cursed with an awful condition. But I still have nightmares of waking up to find her standing at my bedside, watching me sleep. I've been a landlord for almost 20 years. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills. My building is nothing fancy, just a 4-story walk-up on the edge of town. Most tenants keep to themselves, and I like it that way. But there's one room I've always had issues with. It started with the last guy who lived here. Quiet kid, mid-20s, paid his rent on time and barely made a sound. I thought he was one of the good ones, until he came into my office one morning, pale as a sheet, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "I found this under my door," he said, sliding it across the desk. The note was simple, just one sentence, written in shaky handwriting. "You're not safe in here." I tried to reassure him, told him it was probably a prank, maybe a mistake meant for someone else, but he shook his head. No one else on my floor got one, just me. The next week, he called me at midnight. "Someone's in my apartment," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the phone. I grabbed my keys and rushed over. I was wondering why I had not just called the police, but I figured I would need to be there regardless. When I got there, he was standing in the hallway, clutching a baseball bat. His face was pale, his hands shaking, but when I unlocked the door, the apartment was empty. Nothing looked out of place. The locks weren't tampered with, no sign of forced entry. Still, the kid was adamant. I heard them, they were in the closet. I opened the closet myself, nothing. But as I stepped back, I noticed something odd. The closet door had scratch marks near the bottom, faint but deliberate, like someone had been clawing at it. I didn't mention it to him. A week later, he broke the lease, left me a voicemail saying he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and couldn't stay another night in that apartment. "I don't know what's going on in there," he said, "but it's not just me. Whatever it is, it's still there." I wrote him off as paranoid, until the next tenant. She was a single mom with a young daughter, maybe 6 or 7 years old. They moved in about a month after the last guy left. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then one evening, she came by my office. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. "Do you know if someone died in that apartment?" she asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. Not that I know of why. She hesitated and said, "My daughter, she keeps talking to someone. Says there's a man in the closet. She calls him the quiet man." I didn't know what to say. I told her I'd look into it, but I didn't know where to start. The next night, she called me in a panic. "He's here," she screamed. "He's in the closet." By the time I got there, the cops were already outside. She'd grabbed her daughter and ran out of the building, refusing to go back inside. The officers searched the apartment from top to bottom. Once again, there was nothing. The police, however, found something I hadn't seen before. Inside her closet, carved into the wooden frame, were the words, "He never left." The mom moved out the next day. Since then, I haven't been able to keep a tenant in that room for more than a few months. Some leave without explanation, others tell me they can't handle the sounds at night. I've thought about sealing the place off, but I can't afford to lose the rent. I don't believe in the paranormal, so I know there has to be a logical explanation for this. If anyone has any ideas about what to do or what it is, please let me know, because it's costing me a lot of money.